So I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about communication, to talk about how do we talk about immigration, immigrants, immigrant integration in our communities. And I think we've all noticed that some of the rhetoric has gotten a little hotter this year and past months. And as one of the panelists said earlier, it's not because some of these conversations weren't happening. I think they've just been amplified quite a bit through the lens of the election. And so I'm going to talk just 10 quick tips about how to engage in that conversation when and if you feel like you need to in your community. So the first thing to consider really is what are your goals in engaging in any conversation, particularly when if you see it flash across the news headlines and it feels like, oh, this is somewhere that I really need to be part of the conversation. I need to be a spokesperson or I need my folks to be out there. Really think about why. What are you trying to achieve in doing that and where can you make a difference? Because sometimes it is tempting to follow the shiny object, to go after the thing that is making the biggest splash. But really, is there going to be a place to make the conversation that you need to have with your audiences at this moment? And to really think that through when engaging. And it's important to also not just follow your anger, because at least a lot of the headlines are making us all really angry, right? But how can we really engage in conversation in a strategic, meaningful way that move our goals forward? So in doing that, one of the first things to remember is who's your audience? Who are you trying to influence in this conversation? One way to think about that is through this 1 through 5 scale, to think of ones being your base, the folks who are already with you, who understand the issues and who are ready to go and are ready to do what needs to be done to move your issue forward. And the fives are the opposition, the folks who are maybe making the most noise, but who you're probably not going to influence and whose mind you're not going to change. So the folks to consider in your strategic thinking are those twos, threes, and fours, the folks who are at different levels of understanding and acceptance of what you want to do and where you want to go with your issue and how you can bring them along with you. So what do you know about what they're thinking already? What do you want to change about their thinking? And finally, what do you want them to do? And that's important because communication isn't necessarily just about raising awareness or going out to the quote unquote general public. It's really about this strategic thinking about audiences and finding out who amongst these groups are really going to come with you and move forward and make a difference. And it's important to remember with the fives, the folks who are often saying the most ridiculous and outrageous and often untruthful things, um, sometimes there's a temptation just to go out and point out to everybody how wrong they are or to argue directly with them. And I would say that sometimes, depending upon your strategy, that can be not the most useful use of resources or time or energy, because those are folks who you probably are not going to be able to change their mind. They wouldn't change your mind if you think about it. So mostly it's important to think about what is the influence that they're having on those twos, threes, and fours. How are they contributing to the conversations? Are they changing people's minds? Or are there things that they are saying that you can leverage to change the twos, threes, and fours minds? So for instance, if some of the opponents are saying just some truly racist things, often when what often is implicit bias becomes explicit, the threes and fours will become really uncomfortable with that. So you can point it out and say, are you really part of this group that is being so obviously racist and problematic? Or are you part of this group that wants our community to move forward, figure out to solve problems together, and to be a community that accepts and doesn't divide and encourages participation and contribution, not exclusion? Right? So there are ways to leverage the fives against themselves. But again, I would argue that it's not necessarily the best use of time or resources to argue directly with them. And doing that also can really turn off the middle folks. So number three, monitor the conversation. And sometimes we can do that. We'll go to our normal news sources and we'll see what's going on and we'll see, the outrage that the commenters have, or we'll get information from the traditional sources that we listen to or watch or read. It's a good idea to check out a variety of sources and see what is happening in a range of media, to see what the different themes are, what's coming out, what the common metaphors are, and to also note both the positive and negative reactions and comments and ideas. And the reason for this is because we're deeply embedded in these issues, and often we see a headline, or we hear a story, or we see something go through our social media, and we are so angry, right? Because we know the ins and outs of it. We know how wrong it is. We know what's going on. And we sometimes can only see the negative part. We'll only see, like, it seems like everybody's just saying these ridiculous things about immigrants. And is everyone really believing them? Like, this is crazy. So look through and try to really see what the balance, if what is really going on in the conversation. Are there defenders, when these ridiculous things are said? Is there a lot of pushback? Is there a lot of conversation on the other side? Or is it pretty much a one-sided conversation where it really seems like you need to intervene and get some of the truth out there? Because what we don't want to do is overreact, is my point. We don't want to overreact to the point where we just are reacting against every bad headline, every negative thing. We want to try to get a sense of what the real conversation is, who's saying the things that we disagree with, who's pushing back, and who are some of our maybe even unexpected allies in the conversation. And then when monitoring the conversation, try to find out, what is this counter narrative? What is going on here? What are the themes that are coming through? One of the counter narratives that we've seen around immigration is two-piece. This first, the idea that immigrants are a threat to law and order. So you'll hear that when there are discussions about terrorism, when there are discussions about quote unquote illegal immigrants crossing the border, deportation forces, all of these things are in the law and order frame. And then the second theme that's very common is that immigrants are overwhelming scarce resources. That's the idea that there's not enough health care, there's not enough education, there's not enough jobs to go around, that we have scarce resources that we need to protect for quote unquote our own. So I'm sure you're all familiar with those two themes, but it's important to identify, okay, so is the narrative that I'm hearing right now, is it these themes? Are there other themes that are coming up? And this is so you can really identify what you're up against, where you need to counter that theme, what kind of ideas you need to put forward to remove their power from the conversation, basically. The other thing you'll notice with the scarce resources theme in particular is that there's a lot of water metaphors going on there. Waves of immigrants flooding the system, swamps. Metaphors are extremely important in the ways that our brains process information. If you think about a water metaphor, for instance, it's really scary. Nobody wants to be drowned, right? So if you're talking about waves of immigrants or swamping a system, that is something that is eliciting fear in people and something out of their control. And people are really uncomfortable with that, obviously. So watching out for metaphors is important when identifying the counter narrative. How are we referring to folks? You'll see often animal metaphors when talking about immigrants, talking about rounding up, um, and even the sneaking across the border has kind of an animalistic connotation to it. And so watch out for those metaphors, because it's important to know just how people are likely taking this information and what the folks who are saying these things are likely really meaning. To also identify the values. If you think about, law and order is a value in itself. That is something that is extremely important to a lot of audiences. So if someone's a threat to law and order, it's really hard to overcome and then make those folks heroes of the story or not the threats. So to try to think of, what are the themes and values that are coming through, and how can I try to find equally important values to counter the narrative with? And I'll give some examples of those in just a minute. And then what's the moral of the story? What is the outcome that people are trying to get by telling these stories? With the overwhelming of scarce resources, it's that there's, even if we're good-hearted people, there's only so much to go around, and we have to draw a line somewhere. And that line, needs to be where people are considered legal or quote unquote illegal immigrants. That's often one moral of a story. So to try to to really dissect it, to get a good idea of what's going on here, what are these stories likely eliciting in my audiences, what am I up against, and what are some of the intentions of the folks who are telling these stories. Number 5, and this one's important. Understand how the brain reacts to fear and anger. I'm bringing this up because I think that a lot of us have noticed that some of the discussions and conversations that are happening in the election season are particularly fear-based and anger-based. And I think we've seen some of the fallout from that, and it has real world fallout. There have been, some increases in hate crimes in some areas. There are people certainly feeling for their own safety in many areas as well. And countering that fear and anger is a bit tricky, particularly from a communication standpoint. Often in community forums, it's great that relationship building that we heard about earlier can be a really good step. If you're relying solely on communications, media, or social media, there's a few things to remember. So one is that our fear protects us from bodily harm. That is the function that fear does in our brain. So in the part of the brain that is activated, it's one of the oldest parts of the brain. It's one of the brains that tells you to run from the saber-toothed tiger or whatever is trying to endanger you back in the day. That part still exists in our brains. And so when fear is triggered, there's a part of our brain that starts going and it's hard to stop that brain. Some people will call it the downstairs brain versus the upstairs brain. That's the logical place where the adults have a conversation. Once you get that downstairs brain going, it's really hard to bring it back up to a logical conversation. So in remembering that people, when they're angry and scared, that they are not likely to have a logical conversation, then you'll know that facts are not going to make a difference in the conversation. Facts are an important part of communications, but they're not sufficient, particularly in instances like this when people are riled up and worried. And just an example of that, here's a chart that shows the violent crime rate in the United States. And you'll see it's gone fairly steadily down over the years. And you'll see that for a while, perception was tied to that. People were getting it. But you'll see right around 2001, around the time of the terrorist attacks, the spike in perception of crime, spiking beyond what the actual crime rate was, and it's never really returned. So our fear has kept us from really understanding what's really going on and kept us at this high alert that is not going to be, you can show people this graph, you can show them that violent crime is going down, you can tell them that, but it's not necessarily going to make a difference in the way that they're feeling. And so in talking to people when they are riled up, when they're worried, when they're scared, it's usually better to try to start a conversation in the values realm, in something that is going to calm that downstairs brain a little bit. Talk about something they care about, something they relate to, about, what kind of community do we want to be? Do you like the community you live in? Are you proud of it? Well, what kind of community do we want to be? Are we a community that encourages participation and contribution? Or are we one that excludes and divides? Like trying to have a conversation on that level, one that's a little bit more about how we feel about things, can try to really just settle people down a little bit. It's not 100%. Nothing is. I mean, like I said, it's a pretty powerful thing being scared, but trying to just calm the conversation down and not amp it up with your own anger, right? But try to calm it down. Number 6 is to be proactive versus reactive. Sometimes we'll hear all of these crazy things being said, all of these things that are not true, these things that are, harmful to the communities that we're working with or even to our own community. And one of the temptations is just to tell people that's not true. Immigrants don't commit more crimes. Immigrants aren't a threat. Immigrants aren't terrorists. The problem with that is that over and over again, you're just reinforcing what the opponent has said by repeating their message, essentially. Even if you're refuting it, you're repeating it over and over again. So, one of the famous versions of this is Nixon's "I am not a crook," right? What do we all think of Nixon now? Even history aside, if we remember this, we remember crook, because you remember the more powerful language. So if you're saying immigrants are not terrorists, people are going to remember terrorists, and that you just said something about immigrants and terrorists, right? So instead of telling people what isn't true, tell them what is true. So tell them what the truth is. Actually, crime rates, don't even say actually, just tell people what the crime rates are. Tell people how immigrants participate and contribute. Tell people how there is strength in communities that work together and really see, really value each other's humanity and all of those things. Tell the truth instead of only refuting what the other side is saying and repeating their argument essentially. Number 7 through 9 are 3 ways to counter the narratives that are problematic. One is to focus on values, and I've talked about that a little bit. Number is to be rigorously solution oriented. And the third is to really talk about why this is about all of us, why this is about our whole community and how we can thrive together. So the values piece is to talk about our national values, the values that our country was founded on, even if we've never lived up to those values. They're an important part of our identity and who we are. And we really need to make sure that we hold them dear, that people get due process, that we're treating people equally, that we respect basic human rights. Then we want to make sure that we can also talk about our own personal values and how we share those values. We all want what's best for our families. That's true of native-born Americans. That's true of immigrant Americans. It's true across the board, right? We all want to have a job. We want to provide for our families. We want a healthy, safe community. These are things that we all want. We want to talk about solutions to make sure that we're not just complaining about things, right? We want to, here's one way to make our community safer. Here's one way to make sure that we have a great relationship with the police in our community. Here's a way that we can make sure kids have something to do after school. Whatever the things are that we're consistently talking about what the solutions are. Here are the English language learning programs that our community needs, and so on and so forth. And finally, that it's about all of us, that we are stronger when we understand that our differences empower us and make us a better community together. This is about the future, looking forward. It's about moving forward, success. All these kinds of themes can move people towards a more hopeful view rather than just looking at all of the things that they think are wrong, the things that they think have gone bad in the past, but to keep people on this very hopeful arc. Number 10, finally, is to build a message with what we call VPSA. That stands for Value, Problem, Solution, Action. Talk about values first, introduce the problem as a threat to values, always have a solution, and then always have something for your audience to do. You're not just raising awareness or spreading information. You want to move them to action. So that is the presentation for today, and I am happy to take questions in the time that we have left.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was very interesting. I want participants to type in their questions for Julie. It's a very rare opportunity to talk to a messaging expert, and in terms of how you would talk about immigrants and immigration, different communities have different things going on, and this is your opportunity to get some information from Julie. And I wanted to ask you, Julie, there's so many different things to talk about, but certain specific people. So what do you suggest are any good talking points at all about talking about undocumented youth?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Undocumented youth? Is that what you said?
Yes. So we have a lot of, the unaccompanied minors. Chief Kai spoke about the threat of gangs.
So I asked that for the clarification because youth is a really important piece. There's a lot more empathy, sympathy out there for young people. And so by talking about undocumented youth, we can talk about kids who are here have the same dreams as any other kids, who have the same potential as any other kids when given the opportunity that we think that all people deserve, especially young people who are just trying to start off their lives and contribute and participate in a country that they, have a devotion to and want to be a part of. And so a lot of research has shown that people are fairly open to those arguments and feeling fairly supportive of young people in particular. The balance, of course, is to not create a deserving versus undeserving dichotomy between young folks who are undocumented and older folks who are undocumented. We want to make sure that it's not an either or, but a both and. So young people where the sympathy is already going a little bit better, we can start a conversation about, their hopes and dreams and how we want to support, kids and young people. But we want to say that without impugning older folks who face, even steeper challenges.
And you spoke earlier about, giving solutions, telling people the truth. There's another question about how can we incorporate the benefits of immigrant integration for the receiving community into effective messaging strategies.
Right. And so this is really important to have success stories ready to go, but to make sure that those success stories are what we call systemic stories rather than just individual stories. So you want to have lots of examples of contributions from immigrant communities, but we want to make sure that they don't just tell a story of somebody coming here and under their own power succeeding all on their own, because that is an individual striver story narrative that a lot of people have in their heads. And what it excludes is all of the things that we know are important for people to succeed, which is community support. Often it might be ELL classes, it might be small business loans, it might be a number of different things that we know are important on a policy and community level to help immigrants succeed. So any success story should include and point to those systemic level pieces that everyone in the community can be responsible for making sure are in place in order to tell a story of success. And by doing that, you can both show the participation and contribution, so important, also show the community role that is equally important in making sure we're all moving forward towards success.
And I have one final question for you, Julie, which is, now that we know we need to change the narrative, you're giving us the tools, the techniques, these wonderful tips that everyone is so grateful for. How do we just expand that narrative? How do we increase its frequency and reach? I mean, what are the things that we can do to we have the quality, we want quantity now.
Right. And, that has a lot to do with, building partners, right? Finding more and more groups, not just within the immigrant right or immigrant integration community, but rather finding, other groups that are also trying to expand a narrative around inclusion and cooperation and participation and contribution. There are other groups that represent people of color, that represent faith communities that are sometimes feeling excluded, that are representing, lots of a range of groups that all benefit from a narrative that's more about inclusion than about exclusion. So in finding those allies and having their back, as well as hoping that they have your back, but sincerely doing that, we can tell a better story. We can tell a story that is that resonates, and also we increase, our numbers, which is a fantastic way to both organize and also to implement a communication strategy.
Building those coalitions, getting other people to share that responsibility with you, of course, it makes you responsible, indebted to them, so you must have their back. But that's an excellent point, and that's one of the points that ran throughout this webinar, I think, as we heard from the panel, the power of coalitions, the power of getting other people on board with your message. So thank you so much for that, Julie.